You're at a point where you've developed a topic and you've done some research and reading and thinking things through. In our course, that was module 3. And now you're at a point that you want to develop a draft. And so in our course, 4.2 has you outline. And you'll see at the top of your doc where it says eventually you'll develop your paper here. That's where I want you to outline. And so to give us some idea about how to approach that, though, there are directions, but they're way down at the bottom of the doc where it says Module 4. And for planning, I've given you a breakdown about how papers generally look, especially when we're working on a field trend like we are. It's usually an introduction or an opening. And that's hardest to write first because there's nothing to introduce. So I wouldn't even start there, but just know that that's there. And then there's usually background sections. So we can refer back to those and develop a context in a situation that we want to refer to. What's changing that we want to focus on? Usually there's sections on those coming up. And if in the middle, and if you think about sections, that's better than putting subtopics into specific paragraphs because sometimes they need more than one paragraph. And then there's analysis discussion sections. Those are often the hardest to write and think through, but once you've already got things established, they can start to be developed. And then, of course, some type of a concluding sequence, or sometimes just called a conclusion, but we don't want to be too compartmentalized about that or too mechanical about that. So I like to call it concluding sequence. So that's not an outline. That's sort of an outline of an outline. It's generally your sections will go in that sequence, but those are generic terms. Your terms will be more specific than that. So I want to give us one example, and then we'll come back to the top and actually make an outline that's a reverse outline for this paper. So this is a paper that somebody already wrote, and we'll look at what's in it, and then what might their outline have looked like, and we'll map that out, and that'll give us an idea of what outlining might look like. So it's a paper about there being a shortage in CPAs, certified public accountants, and a change in the education for that makes it easier to get through the educational path to hopefully entice more people to go through and get more accountants graduated to deal with the shortage. And they're ultimately in their paper found that they don't think it'll work very well because they think they actually need to fix the salaries and make it more attractive versus things like finance that they're going to go into. So that's the synopsis of their paper, but you'll see there's different parts of it, and it does begin with background. So, there's an introduction, but then it gets into that there's a shortage, and that there's people retiring and fewer people going in. And then it talks about the impacts on companies when they don't have adequately trained accountants or enough accountants, how that impacts the functioning of the entire business. And that they all come together to make basically a big problem for businesses. And then it goes into some of the reasons people don't go into accounting, and the perception of it. And then it comes back to the salaries, or brings in the salaries. And then comes to the problem of getting through the educational program that's pretty involved. And then he gets to that change. So all of those were background sections. And then he gets to a point where the author is shifting over to there being a change to make it easier to get through the educational path. And it puts people in the field as part of their education and removes some classes. So there's a strategy to it as well, not just cutting it apart. And so he goes into details about that. And while this student was writing about it, it happened to have been approved in Michigan while they were writing about it. So that made it kind of timely. And then he talks a little bit about the debates about whether, is this educationally sound? And then, whether it would function to help people get through. And how people feel about, well, is that going to get people into it? So it starts shifting a little bit more toward an analytical route rather than just the background. And he comes to those salaries being a key issue, that if it's easier to get through the educational path, that's only one issue. The other issue is it as viable as a career in terms of pay? and the student is double majoring, and they actually are finding finance to be more of a pull already, because they just find it a little bit more exciting. So, he gets into those issues, and at the end, the conclusion is that he doesn't think it doesn't entice him, and he doesn't think it's going to entice other people and actually fix the problem until they address the PR issue of accounting and the public, just the image of accounting and the salaries, that paying more is going to also make it more enticing. And of course, this is their views. It doesn't have to be conclusive. But then if we were to come around and say this paper doesn't exist yet. So again, I want you to come back to the top where you'll see it says eventually develop your paper here. And you can keep that there, and that's where you're going to actually write your paper, or you can just delete it. And then you can develop your outline there. And that can be based on that, your topic development and your reading and research from module 3. So if you want, you can use this numbered list. And I would suggest, I like the word opening more than introduction. It doesn't have to be one paragraph. We're writing shorter papers, so a lot of times they're not multi-page introductions, but they certainly can be more than one paragraph as needed. And so I like the idea of opening a little bit better. But what exactly is going to go in there? You might have ideas that you can put there, but it might be just knowing that that's got to be there. And it's the hardest thing to write if nothing else exists. So wait on that. And when you've got something to deduce, sometimes a focus statement can help there. But a lot of times that's something that really the way it should be written for the final form, gets developed after there's already something um, to introduce. And then where where this author goes, I'm going to do this very informally. It may not be an exact outline, but to give us an idea, talks about the CPA shortage. And so the section on the shortage, decline and people going in is part of it. As well, the retirements are affecting. A lot of accountants are retiring. And then impacts on business of the shortage. And we could say businesses and giving, maybe some examples of that. And then yeah, the major job seems unattractive compared to finance or other fields. And I don't know that that's true, but that was their view, and it depends on the person. But that can be a factor, and so that can be something that if you're writing to, people in the accounting major or businesses trying to attract accountants, maybe thinking about that can help reframe it, or figure out how to address that. So it could be relevant. And then the pay that, so, actually let's make this like, my typing is horrible today, apparently. Um, and then the low pay changes the math literally for some people. So, and what I'm going to just interject there personally is do what your heart wants to do, because you'll be better at it, and eventually, you'll move up and feel it and enjoy your life better. So, that's something to consider besides pay. But pay obviously is a factor too. So, and then he gets to the proposed fix to accelerate the educational path. All right. And you might have subsections that you get into there. Again, don't imagine these are single paragraphs. You can treat it with how many paragraphs it needs to be clear. That'll let your writing open up and still remain clear. And then he goes into the actual problem isn't the ed path. And then, comes back to the PR and the pay, and personal view. And then there's the concluding sequence may not work. And there's somewhere in here, there's what it is, views on it, yeah, and how it's perceived. And then let's say the student hasn't written this paper yet, and so they've developed this outline. This is the beginning of an outline, but you could they could have interjected what sources come that they're going to use in these different sections, some notes. It can get more detailed than this, but that gives you an idea. It doesn't have to be huge, but that kind of gives you an idea. And then as you write, you move things around or insert things or say, actually that would make sense more here. But you can see it does follow that pattern of having background sections, the change, and then the analysis. That typically ends up making sense. Okay, so that's outlining. And then when you write the draft itself, you could do it within the outline or probably not, probably below it or above it, however makes sense to you. And another nifty thing that you can do if it helps, there are tabs in here. Rather than making new documents, you can add tabs with different bits of things if that helps, you need a fresh space or something like that. That's something I'm not encouraging you to do, but it is something that's available. So you don't need to feel like you have to make bunches of docs. And so that's the outlining. And then 4.3 will be writing a rough draft. And so that the outline kind of helps you get that started. And you can imagine, instead of I need to write the introduction first, being like, well, I'm going to write these background sections first, because those are kind of the most straightforward. And now I've got something on the page. Now, what are those changes I'm talking about, or the focal point, and I want to develop that. And then that gives you something to draw from as you're analyzing and kind of helps get you into the drafting process a little more easily than trying to write a perfect opening to something that doesn't exist. Okay,